Um, Obviously, thank you everyone for being here when this is maybe not the most salient thing on their minds right now. Yeah, so very glad to be giving this talk and to be here with you today. I'll talk for about 20 to 30 minutes and then open up for questions. As Jack said, my focus here and doing this PhD is on Myanmar. This is one of my first empirical projects, beginning to dig into that. So looking forward to kind of co-thinking with the group over the hour. My presentation is focused on civil war in Myanmar that started in 2021. And I look at the role of ethnicity and civilian targeting. So we'll go into it. So the puzzle that this research is trying to think about is, why do governments use collective punishment against civilian populations, despite mixed, but I would say the preponderance of evidence shows that it's a risky strategy because it often can increase involvement in insurgency rather than dampening it. And yet we hold that states are more or less rational. So how can we explain that? The reasons why it may inflame it are studies show that it can increase hatred of the state. It can indiscriminate attacks can push civilians to go towards insurgent groups to provide safety, stability as a shield. And finally, especially if it's group targeted or perceived as group targeted, it can actually increase group threat and solidarity against the state. So the puzzle is, so why do they continue doing this despite these findings? So I'll start with the theory a bit. Most of the evidence asks, so there's two kind of broad buckets that people think about with these strategies. One is draining the sea, which is an attrition-based strategy where you try to increase the costs of civilian participation in insurgency through indiscriminate attacks or discriminate attacks, kind of punishing people who the state knows participated, and make it too costly for them to continue to support the insurgency and to kind of neutralize them. The second broad-based strategy is winning hearts and minds. So this is like what the US said we were trying to do sometimes in Afghanistan and other places, or maybe we should do. And the idea here is you provide benefits so that it reduces people's grievances towards the state and neutralizes them through that alternate pathway. From the literature that I was able to find, and I think this is mostly fair to say, most of the literature looks at which one of these strategies is effective. But there's been few empirical studies saying when and where it varies subnationally. So the state, instead of saying the state has to pick one, the entry point for my theory that I'm trying to develop is that, one, the state doesn't have to pick one. They can systematically vary subnationally. And there's some, and the reason I kind of proposed this and thought of this was Schwartz and Strauss have a qualitative paper in Guatemala where they describe how soldiers from the state would approach different villages, and they would say, based on these, I guess, archival transcripts, that, oh, this village is winnable, and that village is less winnable, and in more winnable, and by winnable, they meant like people could be swayed, like they weren't implacably against the state. In those more winnable villages, they said that the soldiers would advocate for more nonviolent approaches to engaging the citizens, and more targeted, more discriminate violence rather than indiscriminate violence, and also more psychological approaches of like trying to sway them. And so I set out to kind of see if we could look at this more quantitatively in Myanmar, if similar things are happening. The third point is, in Findley and Young posit a formal model for studying winning hearts and minds versus draining the sea. And they similarly find, again, and this is purely theoretical model, that because indiscriminate violence can increase loyalty to the insurgency and hatred of the government, if you're starting from a point where people really, really dislike the government, indiscriminate violence is relatively more effective than hearts and minds, but still both are quite ineffective. It's hard in that situation to win. Whereas if people are closer to the margin of potentially supporting the government, I guess the population, then winning hearts and mind is more tractable and more likely to succeed. So your beginning point creates path dependence for which strategy is more effective, and that's because of cyclical dynamics. So the more indiscriminate violence you use, the further away from winning hearts and minds you become. So when we're thinking about which groups to say are winnable or not winnable, again, winnable is winning hearts and is when you would use winning hearts and mind, and unwinnable is when you would want to drain the sea and use indiscriminate violence. What are the markers by which we can know, by which a government could perceive, so identify, like the identification problem of where groups are? How do they solve that? Some of the literature on one-sided violence, or which I think is broadly similar to discriminate violence, is that people use identity markers, such as ethnicity or religion, the group level identity markers, as a heuristic for whether populations are winnable or unwinnable. A key facet of, and I think Chandra talks a bit about this, like a key facet of identity is how elastic it is, like how easy you can move in and out of it. Kinship-based identity markers, such as ethnicity, are quite hard to move out of because usually there's some kind of visual identifiability, and you're like based in a community, so it's hard to move out of it. Whereas some things like religion, relatively, are easier to conversion in most religions. And I'll argue in Myanmar, all the religions in Myanmar have more or less open conversion: Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. So these are the identity markers that which I will argue are very likely to be used by the Myanmar government when it gets to the empirical. So very quickly, I wanted to just show this kind of visual description. This is the standard model where the state does not vary subnationally. It perceives civilians as one unit, or the war, the rebellion as one unit, and they either select winnable or unwinnable, and then they, based on that, select their strategy. My most basic argument is that they perceive groups differently based on these identity markers. Some are elastic, some are more inelastic, and so you should see subgroup differentiation in the model, or in the data, in terms of how they use civilian indiscriminate violence. So I guess explicitly.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah, please.
So in the paper, you talk about this endogeneity problem.
Yeah.
Right. So the governments have like this long history. Like, so I mean, model makes lots of sense, but then you're a state, you know these people. This isn't the first time you're confronting them. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So Myanmar is incredibly fractionalized ethnically, and it has the longest running civil war in the world. And so you're right that like the state has an incredible amount of data and heuristics for how different ethnic groups would react. So,
and that would be true of any state, pretty much, right? I mean,
yeah, totally. I guess they have more active insurgency data because none of these insurgents are like whole cloth new, but yes, absolutely. So the second thing I'll argue is that there was a shock after the coup, like a realignment, where we should see their behavior shift. But you're right that at a first cut, this would be true in most contexts, and maybe especially true in Myanmar. Does that answer your question? Please.
No. I'm just curious. I'm just thinking, if we get beyond the case of Myanmar,
Yeah.
like what would this look like? Like for implications for your theory.
So I think that outside of Myanmar, I think that the main I think the implications for my theory would be that asking, does draining the sea versus winning hearts and minds, which one is more effective? Just shouldn't assume that states don't vary subnationally. So I think that's like empirically one thing. And then I think finding exogenous shocks would be necessary to test the theory or the updating of the perception. I guess a follow-on to this is that, as I said before, more elastic identities, such as religion, should function as less strong identification factors than ethnicity, because providing benefits requires like identifying people in future rounds. And therefore, if I could shift my religion, so say the government commits to benefits in T0, in the next time period, and I can shift my religion, I could get the benefits later. So ethnicity should be a better identifier and a more strategically useful kind of differentiator between groups. And finally, I think going back to this idea of path dependence, the use of violence should itself push, the use of indiscriminate violence should push groups away from the state. So the more violence is used, the less valuable winning hearts and minds becomes as a strategy in future rounds. It's kind of like a self-fulfilling dynamic or vicious cycle dynamic. So this is another kind of graphic saying that, and this is kind of going into the vicious cycle of if I use indiscriminate violence, the perception of winnability for that group should go down because now that group's experienced indiscriminate violence, which should lower the value of selective violence in future rounds and have less of that and more indiscriminate violence. So this just modeling what I just said. To Jen's question about like, when would we see an information shock where we would see like a disjuncture of kind of like strategy? It would be when the government has miscalculated, and we would have to like have some defensible way of saying the government's miscalculated the perception of like their heuristics or have been shown to be wrong for which groups support them and how much. Yeah, and so that's exactly what I'm hoping to convince people that has happened in Myanmar. So I think most people here are broadly familiar with Myanmar, so I'll just do this very quickly for time. But it's highly ethnically fractionalized. The primary cleavage for all of its civil war has always been ethnicity, and religion is a secondary cross-cutting identity factor. Specifically, Buddhism is aligned with the state or the state military. And the state military is Bama, and it's ethno-nationalistly Bama and also ethno-religious, or sorry, religiously Bama is like a core part of his identity, and they think of Myanmar as a Buddhist state. Yes, and this is a very intense conflict with a lot of different active groups. As Applett's graph shows, they've said it's the most intensive conflict in the world. This was before, this graphic was made before Gaza, which I'm pretty sure would change this. Okay, so what is the data I'm using to try to penetrate this a little bit? I'm using ACLED township level data set from 2021, which was the first date of the coup, to 2024, like roughly 3-year time period. ACLED is quite well known, like, while certainly not exhaustive. They have a team of people manually and automatically going collecting data online through many different sources, and they have people on the ground collecting data. So it's one of the most comprehensive data sets we have access to that's clean. It's not like GDELT or some other fully automated data collection process. Within this time period, we have just over 40,000 violent events. 14,000 of which are insurgent attacks against the state, and 26,000 of which are violence against civilians by any actor, not only the state, but the vast majority of that is state against civilians. And finally, so I merged this with demographic data that was collected in 2016 on ethnicity and religion, also at the township level. So finally, I wanted to make the argument for why during this time period of intensive violence, we should expect a rapid updating of the Myanmar military's perception of the Bama majority, their winnability. So since the beginning of, for the whole 70-year period of civil war, the Bama majority has never en masse armed itself against the military. They haven't always supported the military, and Aung San Suu Kyi, who was an antagonist of the military, was Bama. So it's not to say they're aligned, but they've never taken up arms against it. And nonviolence was especially promoted by Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD party, which is absolutely dominant in the Bama heartland. Also, USDP, which is the military's political wing, doesn't do well in these places, but still does better than they do in the ethnic areas. So there's no indication that the military would expect a massive uprising, which I'm about to show you is quite extensive in the Bama heartland and in the periphery, in both. And there's been a realignment where they're more or less equally mobilized against the military with, a lot of variation, but to zoom out a little bit. In contrast, the ethnic armed groups were armed before the Civil War, before the British left. They kicked out the British, or helped kick out the British, some of them, and have been fighting with the Myanmar military ever since. There's been a lot of ethnic tension, so certainly they were seen as more implacable. And even verbally, the coup leader has said he was surprised by the Bama's level of resistance after the coup, but he didn't say that about the ethnic periphery. And so here you can see this is the kind of, this area here is the Bama heartland. It's known as Anya, and huge amount of indiscriminate violence and a huge amount of some of the most fierce fighting has happened in this area, and that's never happened before. Usually it happens in the mountain, and this is the flat land. So usually it happens on the peripheries. This is kind of more expected, but here, this area is quite new, and also, I would argue is a big update if you were to think about where would this civil war go before the coup happened. Okay, so what is the data that ACLED has let me pull out of this? I can distinguish between two different types of violence. The first is indiscriminate violence, and the second is discriminate. And these are conservative categories, I would argue, because the indiscriminate violence is necessarily indiscriminate, more or less, like airstrikes, shellings, explosions, comparatively are much harder to target than sexual violence, abductions, and like in-person violence, because you can see the people, you can try to identify them. In the prior, it's almost always villages, and the Myanmar military does not have like super guided missiles. These are almost all unguided missiles. And the second thing I have is insurgent attacks against the state. So I can look at, and what I do is I ask, if there's an attack against the state, what is the likelihood of indiscriminate or discriminate violence against civilians in the same township, either that day or in like a few days after? So is there a reprisal pattern going on? I also try to, again, from ACLED, control for all different types of violence that aren't what I'm as interested in. This includes like arrests, looting, excessive force during protests. The protests themselves are not necessarily insurgencies, but they could incite violence. So I also want to control for those. I also want to control for pro-military attacks. So these are like militia groups that are not the military and are not directly controlled by the military. And finally, I want to control for insurgent attacks against civilians, because that's likewise not the state that I'm interested in. And here's just a quick breakdown of kind of the descriptive statistics. Like there's 325 townships. The average in Myanmar is about 60% Buddhist, or sorry, 80% Buddhist, 60% Burmese. And there's a good bit more discriminate violence than indiscriminate, but still many cases of both. Okay. The estimation model I use is like a hybrid effects model that lets me look at time varying and time invariant. So time invariant is like the ethnicity and religion. Time variant is like the attacks. And I include these lagged. I include different models, some of which have lags, some of which don't, to try to make sure I'm not missing key factors in terms of like how quickly the government would attack civilians. And as I mentioned, I controlled for other types of violence. It isn't what I'm interested in. I'll show you this visually in a second, but my hypotheses, and I've cleaned this up, so all of the like sub interactions for, and I'm not showing all the sub interactions, but so let's see, B4, beta 4, is just asking if Bama are being attacked, the rate of attacks, when an attack happens, the rate of attacks against Bama. And then B6 is asking, as we move forward in time, or sorry, beta 6, as we move forward in time, are we seeing more reprisals against Bama populations versus non-Bama populations, and also against religious Buddhist versus non-Buddhist populations? This one says Bama. So those things let me look at the different hypotheses that I spoke about a while before. Okay, so this is kind of like the main graphic to the first question of, is there subnational variation? And I think there's pretty clear evidence that for both Burmese, which is in the red, and Buddhist, which is in the blue, there's more discriminative violence being used and less indiscriminate violence. Because as you can see in this discriminate one, both of these, so this is comparing the two. This would be compared to Burmese against non-Burmese and Buddhist against non-Buddhist. So there's somewhat, but measurably more insurgent attack, or sorry, discriminate violence in here. You see a pretty substantial decrease in indiscriminate violence. This last one was added on as a comment of saying, like, can we compare these as a ratio? Like if like that is the absolute number, like, and I think conceptually that like requires us to like say that the government is constrained in the total number of attacks they can use. They would have to like run out of bullets at some point or something like that, which I'm not sure is entirely convincing. But anyway, so the ratios are pretty much the same. Maybe, and sorry, this ratio would say if it's lower, it would say there's less indiscriminate violence and higher. So we're seeing some slight evidence that there's less indiscriminate violence for the Burmese and no real difference, but directionally, oh, this is all 95% confidence. So there's like, this is kind of mildly agrees with our hypothesis, but it's pretty close. For ratio. That supports ethnicity as a proxy for winnability, because we're seeing more indiscriminate violence. The second one asks, this is now we're looking at whether the state has updated between the two time periods. And I did a clean kind of just median date. So this is saying on the second half of the dates, are we seeing more attacks? Sorry, are we seeing that the protective identifiability, the perception of winnability is going down over time? Because we know that two things. One, as I mentioned before, the government had a lot of signals that there was an uprising, that people were very much not aligned with them. And as that happened, the government started using more and more violence. So we should see as they use some violence, some indiscriminate violence, the use of indiscriminate violence should continue. So this is comparing the second to the first half. Interestingly, we see the same thing where discriminate violence is used more for Buddhist and Burmese in the second half compared to the first half. So it's similar to like when we didn't separate it in half at all. But we see a pretty big difference in Buddhist and Burmese when we break those out. We see that the protective effect for indiscriminate violence of being Burmese actually is slightly higher as a coefficient in this one and a little bit tighter. But the Buddhist one went pretty much to null. So it seems like there's some small evidence that for the more elastic one, that stopped being a good signal of winnability, but the government kind of doubled down on this idea that the Burmese are the winnable population. We don't want to use indiscriminate violence against, at least in my theoretical model. And I'll have some ideas for why that might be later. But so the kind of updating or the dynamic hypothesis is more or less not supported, but there's some weird evidence around Buddhist versus Burmese. Yes. So to close, I guess I'll try to interpret this a little bit more. So for hypothesis 2, the idea that religion is a less strong signal than ethnicity, we did find evidence of that potentially. But we find that indiscriminate violence actually was even less likely to occur to Burma in the second half. Your point about Myanmar being like, how does Myanmar compare to other states? I think this theory, obviously this is not good evidence for the theory, but I think this case may be quite unique. That makes it hard to test this. One, the army has no alternate constituency. It's not like even in Syria where there are some groups on the ground which maybe support the regime. In Myanmar, the Burma were their one and only major constituency, and they have no one else to go to. So maybe this makes draining the sea less attractive if you have no alternate kind of backup. Also, potentially the updating happened in earlier. So I did a median cut, but you could think about cutting in different time periods to see when updating happened. Maybe it happened early in 2021, not mid 2022. Or maybe even as the Burma became less winnable, the perceptions of the ethnic minorities became even less winnable. So because I'm comparing them against each other, if they both move, but one moves faster, you could also see this kind of result. Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of interpreting the data is that this is probably not due, so indiscriminate violence is probably not due to a loss of control by the military. We can be pretty sure that the violence we're seeing by the military is intentionally produced by them. Myanmar military is based on the Japanese military model and has like very, very strong chains of command. They live on kind of army bases with their families, and so there's like a lot of indoctrination and social isolation, which makes them fairly controllable. And finally, we're controlling for militia separately from the military, so we can distinguish that in the ACLED data. I'm a bit over time, sorry for that, but thank you all for listening. Again, I'm really interested in these like dynamic updating models, so I would love to hear more from you about what will be more convincing, how to think about other cases, or any other comments. Thank you. I'll just leave this up here. A second.